It's never too late. It's never too early either. But, I think Sarah and I can hand on heart say that we've never met anyone who said that they wish they'd paid less into their pension. And I think Sarah's mentioned some of those things that, the benefits of starting earlier, that magic of time. But it doesn't matter when you pay into your pension, you'll get that tax relief. And, if you're an employee, then your employer will also pay into that pension for you.
This episode is sponsored by Saxo Markets. Welcome to the Investing Insiders podcast, where we help you achieve financial well-being by making smarter money decisions. I'm Brianne.
And I'm Antonia.
And in today's episode, we're diving into all things pensions and how to make sure you have enough saved for a comfortable retirement. Joining us today are pensions experts Sarah Pennells and Clare Moffat from Royal London. Sarah and Clare, welcome to the show.
Hi.
Thank you very much for asking us. Hi.
Well, we're really looking forward to digging into this because there are so many things to cover with pensions. I suppose what would be a really good starting point is thinking about how good are we in the UK at saving for retirement? What does the landscape look like at the moment?
I think it's quite a mixed bag, really. I think the short answer is that we're a lot better now than we would have been if we didn't have automatic enrolment from 2012. So, anybody who's employed, who's between the age of 22 and state pension age and who earns £10,000 or more from that job, instead of having to fill in paperwork and think, do I join my employer's pension scheme? Do I not join? Do I join now? Do I not join? I mean, they get plonked into it. And that started to be phased in from 2012, as I'm sure lots of your listeners are aware. But I think the figures around what it's achieved are quite interesting because there are about 22 million people who are either employed or indeed on a contract who are saving for their retirement now through a workplace pension. And before 2012, that was 10 million. So more than double. So I think from that point of view, tick, 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 automatic enrolment has made a big difference and got people who otherwise wouldn't have joined their employer's pension scheme to start saving. But I think in terms of, if you broaden it out and think, well, are we a nation of people who, we love our pensions, we think they're absolutely marvellous? And being, I guess, more serious, do we really think about what we might need in retirement? Do we sort of check in with our pensions? Do we think about, actually, what do I need to be saving? I think I think the answer is probably some people do, definitely, but not everybody does. And we do a lot of research we have done over the years, focusing on things like cost of living and financial resilience and workplace pensions, as you would expect. And there are a couple of stats that sort of leapt out at me. One is that almost 7 in 10 adults say they don't know how much is in their pension pot. So that's quite, I think it's quite a sobering stat. So I think if you think about, yes, we are, particularly people who are employed or on a contract, most of us now are saving for retirement. But, and it's a big but, people who are self-employed, there's no similar scheme. So it's down to you to work out whether you can afford to save, how much, how to go about it, all that kind of stuff. And then I think if you look at how much is being saved, we know that lots of people are asking questions about whether this 8% that goes into your pension, from your employer tax relief, is that enough to give you the retirement that you want? And for most people, that answer is no.
I'm sure many people listening will know how, that 8% is made up, but is it useful to kind of explain exactly how that does work? And because we get lots of questions about this and people thinking that 8% is something that they have to pay. So, just to kind of explain, it's 4% of your salary comes from you as an employee. Then your employer pays in 3%. Now that's from their own money. And then 1% comes from the government in the form of tax relief. So that's like a top up from the government. Now, these are the minimum amounts. Your employer might pay in more. I think it's really important to say that staying in your pension is really important. You might think that seems like a lot of money, but if you don't pay in, your employer's not going to pay in and you're not going to get that tax relief from the government. And I think, when we start thinking about this and digging into it in a bit more detail, this is really important. And, you benefit from compound interest, which we always talk about as being the magic of time, really. And, Sarah was talking about that this has been a benefit to millions of employees. It's also worth saying that there's lots of people who are self-employed who don't have access to auto-enrolment. And if you've got multiple jobs and they're all under £10,000, then you won't be automatically enrolled as well. So I think there's people missing out on contributions. And, that means that it's affecting those on a low income in particular. And also, there's potential reforms to auto enrollment. That's quite key, because if we bring in more low paid and part-time workers, now many of these people are women, then that's a good thing. And, we want people to have a good retirement and enjoy the things that they currently enjoy. And so having more in their pension is important.
So you just mentioned there that 8% is usually insufficient. So if someone is listening to this and they are currently paying that 8%, so they're between them and their employer, what would you suggest they do? How do they know what would be sufficient?
I think I'll leave Claire to answer the kind of like the how you go about paying in more and the various mechanisms, because there are some really good mechanisms that can help you to pay in more, and it may not be nearly as painless as you could imagine. But I think one of the things that maybe people don't do is to work backwards, and from that I mean actually think about what retirement might look like. When do they want to retire, or to put it another way, when do you want to not have to work in order to pay your bills? Because we hear from a lot of people saying, I love my work. I want to carry on. I don't really think of myself as someone who's going to be retiring. And it's like, well, that's fantastic. If you love your job and you want to carry on, amazing. But there are a couple of things. Firstly, being a bit grim for a second, you may have a health problem that means that you actually can't carry on working for as long as you want to, or you may end up caring for a relative who has a health problem. There may be things, life has a horrible habit of getting in the way of your best laid ideas. And the other thing is that even though you might want to carry on working till you're a certain age, wanting to do it and actually having to do it are two different things. So rather than thinking of retirement as being something, you sort of shuffle off into this life of not having your identity from work, or, what do you do? Actually, sort of flip it round and think about, I might want to carry on working, but what's the age that I want to not have to work or work in the way I do now and pay my bills? So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, what's your lifestyle going to look like? And again, I mentioned our research. So we did some research last year with 4,000 UK employees who had a pension. And we were really trying to get under the skin of what motivates them, what do they like about their pension, what do they not like, what do they put in? How do they check on their pension? How often? All this kind of stuff. And one of the questions we asked was, how much do you think you would need per year for a good standard of living in retirement? Now, the average figure was about £58,000, which is a lot of money. Now, averages, there was a lot of difference in that. Some people thought they'd need very little. Some people thought they'd need £200,000 a year or more, which is definitely living the life of Riley when you stop work. So if you look at the median, which some people think is a much more accurate way of looking at averages, it was about 32,500. But that's still a fair amount to have to save for when you think about how much the state pension might give you. So it's about thinking, because one person's retirement could look very different to another person's retirement in terms of when they want to stop work or be free of having to work, and also what they might want to live on. So I think Claire will probably be sort of picking up on actually what the different mechanisms are if you think, well, it's 8%, which your employer might be paying in. And it's worth saying they could be paying in more anyway. So check that as a first starting point. But whatever is going into your pension, if you want to pay more, then there are different ways of doing it.
It's funny. I try not to talk about numbers very much. I think most people struggle with numbers a little bit, but sometimes they can be quite useful. And I think that if you look at someone who might get the full state pension, I know Sarah is our state pension expert, so she can talk a little bit more about that. But if you look at someone who's going to get the full state pension, with your workplace pension at a sort of minimum contribution of 8%, is that going to be enough? So we ran some numbers. We looked at someone who was starting work at age 22, so that's the first point they'd be auto-enrolled as well, on £24,000 a year. We assumed some growth at 5% a year after charges. Now, you might have more growth, you might have less, but we also looked at them having an annual pay rise of 2.5%. So what would someone in that situation have at their state pension age of 67 with their workplace pension and their state pension? So that actually would give someone about just kind of over £36,500 a year. Now, that might be enough for some people, but it might not be enough for others. And that's looking at someone at 67. And I think it's really important because if you talk to many people they don't want to work until they're 67. Now, Sarah mentioned that some people do want to work. Some people want to stop work at 60. Some people want to stop work at 55. So the sooner you stop work, the longer you're going to have to fill more of a gap before you get that state pension age. And, I mentioned kind of some of the issues with women. Those numbers are based on someone working full time for all of that time. Now, for many people, especially women, they might have taken time out to care for children, to care for elderly relatives. And so they might not have that full-time work for all of that time. And when we look at workplace pensions specifically, this is based on a percentage. So less pay, less pension contributions. And I think, the gender pension gap is an issue. The gender pay gap is narrowing, but the gender pension gap isn't. So, that's something for everyone to think about. And I'd say, it's I know a lot of women in their 40s and 50s who wish they'd understood a bit more about some of the effects of decisions that they made in their 20s and 30s. Now, that doesn't mean they'd make different choices, but sometimes knowing about that helps. And this is for, men and women to think about in kind of the early parts of their careers, especially. But yeah, I think that's going to be useful to kind of, it's all about what people expect and want in retirement sometimes. But I think it's often about, as Sarah mentioned, it's thinking about, are there things you enjoy now that you want to do in the future?
Right. I mean, that's all really interesting and goes into some detail about how your contributions are going to affect what you end up retiring with, and how you can make adjustments to make sure that you're comfortable in your retirement. But obviously, the other thing that affects your retirement pot is going to be your pension fund performance. So we did quite a lot of research into pension fund performance recently, and we found a massive dispersion between the top performing and the bottom performing funds. I mean, it was huge. So how, in your opinion, how much does fund selection matter over the long term?
I would always say that, when you're looking at fund performance, people should be looking at that. So checking your pension regularly to understand what's going on is really important. So, how much is in your pension?
How often would you suggest people check it?
Well, and this is an interesting one, because some people check it too frequently, especially when there's things like a bit of stock market volatility. Now, I think it's important to remember pensions are long-term investments. So, especially if you're not accessing your pension for 30 years, then checking it could make you feel a bit more nervous and anxious. So, I think if people are looking at it, certainly we want people to look at their pensions at least once a year. And we found that about kind of over 70% of people were checking them once a year. So that could be when their annual statement comes in. But lots of providers have got apps. So that will, help. You can have a look. You can see how your fund's doing. You can have a look at the growth. And if you've got lots of pensions, then you'll be looking at all of these. And that gives you a bit of an idea of, well, how is that fund performing? And, whether you might want to think about moving it or doing something with it if it's not performing. But yeah, I would always say don't look too frequently, especially, when you're further away from retirement, because, we know that there's volatility in the stock market, and actually that's common over the longer term. So, really, it's even if you're coming closer to retirement, that is a point when you're going to be accessing your money. So it's maybe a bit more important. But checking it every day, for example, is not normally a good idea, because it could just worry you more.
Yeah, we say that for all investing, isn't it? So when someone's checking it, you often have the option of, you can look at 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. How, if I was just a normal, pension saver, how many years performance should I be looking at?
Oh, and I think that varies as well. So I think it's important not to be just looking at kind of the short term, and actually, if you looked at different funds, then there could be issues in lots of different funds, because, we saw that last year in March where there was huge amounts of volatility. And that's, the geopolitical situation worldwide, kind of, there's lots of different things that impact pension funds. But I think if you are looking at your funds, you want to be looking at how it's doing against a benchmark and looking back will be useful to try and help work that out. And, I think it's, whatever you're doing, whether that's whatever type of investing, it is useful to kind of see how that performance has been and whether there has been consistent poor performance, for example. But I think it's a bit different when you're looking at your pension from your ISA or other investments, because it is a much longer term investment. So, it might be that there's a reason it hasn't performed as well. But when you're comparing it to other funds, for example, they might have been performing a lot better. So that benchmark with industry benchmarks can be really useful to help you understand, well, actually, how is it performing in relation to those as well, to help you work out, well, do I need to do something about this? Do I need to change the fund? And also because, actually you might have in the workplace space, you might have been put into, well, everyone's put into the default fund. And actually you might be willing to take a bit more risk and move it to a fund that could do a lot better, perhaps you're many years from retirement. So you're willing to take on a little bit of risk. And I think that's always something that's really useful to see, that, risk is a really tricky concept, that more risk can mean more growth, but you've got that chance of losing your money as well. But the younger you are, probably the more risk you can take in terms of your pensions, because you're going to be further away. And we certainly found that those who are aged sort of 18 to 24 are more likely to change their pension fund investment than older employees. But as I mentioned, the closer you get to taking money out of your pension, well, you kind of might be a bit less willing to take on risk. So I do think it's important to have a think about the risk you're willing to take, because if you really are someone who's a lot more cautious, then if you look at different similar funds and different companies, those lower risk funds might all be kind of about the same kind of growth, for example. So you have to, it's kind of comparing apples with apples rather than apples with peers. You've got to make sure you're comparing the right things.
I mean, it's quite complicated, because you mentioned about benchmark there. And from my experience with the people that I speak to, if you say to them, listen, check what your performance is, and they'll go, oh yeah, my advisor told me I'm doing all right, I'm getting 4% or whatever. And I'm like, okay, have you checked it against a benchmark? And they're like, what's a benchmark? What benchmark do I use? When I go into my app, I'm not seeing a benchmark. So it's quite difficult to give people guidance in that area, or provide them with enough information that it can be useful. And the other thing is that if your fund is, say, let's say you go and have a look at it against the benchmark, and it's underperformed consistently for 5 years, for 10 years, what should they do? Should they then think about switching? Because we always say your past performance doesn't guarantee future performance. How do they? People get quite confused about risk levels and how much risk they should take, and then we get asked questions like, well, how many funds should I be in? Should I spread myself out between different funds a bit more? So I'm just wondering what your take on any of that. I realise I've just thrown a whole bunch of questions at you all at once. So make of it what you will.
So I think it's about finding the right information sometimes. So there should be investment fund fact sheets, and they should talk about the aims of the fund, what it invests in, how it's performed over those time periods, and they will compare it with an index that is benchmarked against. So that can help. I think that it might just be that the fund you're in hasn't been performing. So you could stay with the same provider and just change funds. So that might be something that you want to do. Now, you could think about transferring or switching or combining. There's lots of different words used from talking about kind of moving your pension from one place to another. Now, I think that's different if you have a personal pension. So that's one you've set up yourself, you pay into, you get some tax relief. Or if you're in a workplace pension. So the main thing I would say is, if you're in a workplace pension, you have to be really careful, because if you move that pension fund somewhere else, then actually you might lose the benefit of that employer contribution. So that's really important, and that can affect, your future. So if you're in the situation where you think your fund's not performing, you would only get that contribution from your employer if you stay within kind of that provider. It's about looking at different funds. Now, normally there's a choice of many different funds. So have I think about that kind of first. If it's a individual pension, it's your own personal pension, then you might want to think about, oh, should I move this? Or maybe it's an old workplace pension and you're not getting that contribution from your employer. Again, I think it's about not rushing into it. It's about kind of checking. They might have more funds available, but there might be a charge for having access to more funds, for example. And again, it's about looking at kind of what funds are performing really well and does that align with your risk profile. Now, most providers will have risk kind of profile tools that will help you work through that. If you have an advisor, then they can really help you with that risk. But, I always say that if people are thinking of moving their pension, then just be aware that there are some reasons why you wouldn't want to move that pension. So especially if you've got old pensions from the 1980s or 1990s, these might have some valuable guarantees. So just be careful. But if you've got pensions kind of later on, they were in workplace pensions, for example, you might not have these. And actually moving that pension could mean that you save on charges because the charges might be less. There might be slightly higher charges, but you might have access to more funds. And for some people, it's actually about saving life admin. So, if they've got a lot of pensions, and we found, people tend to move job a lot more frequently now. So you could have, 7, 8, 9, 10 pensions, for example, moving them into even 2 or 3 different pensions could really help with that life admin. And when we talk to people, that's one of the things that they really struggle with. So, yeah, so I think it's about thinking about what you can do if you're getting that employer contribution and looking at different funds within the same pension, but also, thinking about, well, actually, is it worth switching or combining my pensions? Will that save me charges, which could impact growth? Will that make life admin a bit easier?
So I'm interested to know because if I'm in a position where my fund is underperforming its peers over say 5 years, from a Royal London perspective, if a fund has consistently done that, what kicks in internally that presumably there's something internally that kicks in to try and help turn that around? Or, because is it the case that you might come out of that fund and go into another fund, but then something happens internally that means that if you'd stuck with the fund that you had, it starts to perform better? Like, are there sort of processes that happen?
Well, I'm not, as Sarah and I, neither of us are experts on kind of investment. And actually, we don't really talk about Royal London's products and investments particularly, just more about kind of pensions in general.
We don't, in our day jobs, we don't really talk about Royal London products. We talk more generally about the kind of decisions people can make. So we can get that information, but I would say it's not something we really speak about on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I guess it is fascinating, contrary to popular belief, talking about pensions, because there are so many different aspects. I suppose thinking about your future self and what that lifestyle looks like, and then working backwards to how you're going to be able to fund that. I suppose some of the things that we often hear or questions that we get are about the state pension and to what extent that can help supplement your income during retirement. And some people wonder if they could just rely on the state pension wholly once they decide to retire or reach state pension age. It would be great to get both of your perspectives on what degree we can look to the state pension as a fundamental part of retirement income, or is it something that people should think about as kind of separate and an addition to how they're going to be able to fund their retirement life?
It's also not a guarantee, is it? So there's that to factor in.
Yeah, they're both really great questions. And as you say, I think a lot of people do have questions about the state pension and, what it is, how much they're going to get, when they're going to get it. And, for most people, let's be honest, it is the foundation of their income in retirement, no matter how much or how little they have on top. So at the moment, for people getting the full new state pension, which is those who reach state pension age after kind of April 2016, come April, the state pension amount is going to increase to kind of around about £12,500 a year. But it's not it's not going to give the kind of income that most people will need or want for the lifestyle they want in retirement. And a few years ago, I and 5 of our customers tried to live on the state pension just for a week, but just to get a sense of actually what are the kind of decisions that I would have to make, and the customers who joined me, if we did just have the state pension. So try to be, obviously it was just for a week, so quite a short term, but try to be as accurate as possible about the kind of costs that we might have in retirement, and sort of drew up a budget and all this kind of stuff. And I remember the first day that I went to the shops. I just went to the local supermarket, and I had my list of things that I was going to buy. And I got to the till, and I'd worked out how much I wanted to spend first, my initial shop, which I would then top up later in the week. But this was at a time when inflation was quite high. It was a few years ago. And I was going to spend sort of £2.50 more on my first day than I planned, which doesn't sound like much. But at the time, I think the full state pension was around just under £200 a week or something like that. So that was quite a lot from how much I planned. And I actually I remember sort of standing at the till thinking, should I put this back? Do I go kind of over my budget on day one? I've only been living on the state pension for 3 hours. This feels like a really bad way to kind of run this experiment. So, looking back at the week, technically I survived for a week and I had a little bit of money left over, but I ate completely differently. I just wasn't buying the sort of food. And I don't mean, buying luxury, running up and down the high street, buying lobster, which I wasn't doing that week. I just had, not as much variety in the food. I made a conscious effort to do free and low cost things. And although I couldn't save, I just didn't have any money left over for those kind of emergencies. And at the time I had 2 dogs. I have one now, but although I could afford to feed them on the state pension, I couldn't afford to get vet treatment or to pay for insurance. And that made me think, because, when I eventually do retire, I want to have 1 dog, maybe I want to have 2, but to not be able to get them treated if anything happens. And one of them was very sadly completely accident prone. So, we have our own seat at the vets virtually. But it was quite a sobering thought that actually I wasn't necessarily somebody who wanted to go on a cruise, 3 or 4 times a year, but I did want to have a dog and not worry about being able to pay the bills. So, £12,500, I think for most people, that is not enough to give them the kind of lifestyle they want. And in fact, I mentioned the figures earlier on of people telling us they want £32,500 or £58,000 a year, depending on how you calculate the average. I think the other thing to say is, although that is the full amount, if you've paid national insurance for 35 years or been credited with it, our research showed, we did a Freedom of Information request a couple of years ago, which showed that only half of adults reaching state pension age that year got the full amount. So we keep talking about this figure of, 12,000 or 12,500, but many people don't even get that. They might have been employed with low income or working for themselves and making a small amount of profits. They didn't pay national insurance, working abroad. All those kind of things can feed into why you may not get the full state pension. And then thirdly, and we've alluded to it briefly, is actually when you get the state pension, because at the moment, the state pension age is 66, but come 6th of April, that will start rising to 67 and then, further rises to 68 planned. And some people may be very happy working for that long, but others won't. So yes, I think don't underestimate the worth of the state pension, because if you were to try and build up a pension pot to pay you £12,500 a year, that would be quite a lot of money. But equally, it's for most people, is not going to give them the kind of lifestyle they want in retirement.
Sarah, I love that experiment, that week of living off the state pension. I might even give it a shot myself, although I don't think my family would thank me for it.
I have to tell you, Antonia, I think intellectually, I was thinking, what will that be like? What I hadn't really prepared for was actually how emotionally I'd feel. As I said, in the shop when I was standing at the till thinking, do I put this back? And then kind of on day 3 of eating I like cooking. I cook quite a lot, but sort of eating not very exciting pasta and tomato sauce or whatever I'd made, and then thinking about what I could do. And the options in terms of, socializing were quite limited. It was actually how I felt about it emotionally that was the surprise, rather than the reality of budgeting and all those kind of things. It was really interesting to do, but I have to say I was quite glad when it was over.
In terms of what you're eating and things, it must go back to the kind of things that you ate as a student, because the students face the same sort of challenges, don't they? And you end up eating a lot of carbohydrates because it's baked potatoes and pasta and rice that are the cheapest things to eat. So you just load up and processed bread. So it's not necessarily the healthiest way to eat as well. So another good reason why you really need to save into a private pension and not rely on the state one.
Absolutely agree. I mean, definitely I felt like I wasn't getting that much variety of food. So I was cooking from scratch because I like doing that anyway. But I just, at the end of the week, I was like, that was quite a boring diet. I wasn't really getting the variety that I would normally like, because, things like, veg was quite expensive. So I was trying to buy some, but it was very revealing for me. And quite a sobering experience, thinking, okay, doing it for 1 week is one thing, but that being your reality and knowing that those are the choices you're going to have to make on an ongoing basis, it really brought it into very sharp focus.
This episode of the Investing Insiders podcast is sponsored by Saxo Markets. Saxo provides access to a broad range of global assets through a sophisticated trading platform. You can trade US stocks from as little as $1 per trade and UK stocks from $3 per trade. Please remember that all investing involves risk. The value of your investments can go down as well as up, and you could get back less than you invest. Terms and conditions apply. Visit Saxo Markets to learn more.
Presumably some pensioners are still paying for their mortgages and things like that as well. So when you take out all of those additional things, it leaves you with almost, I mean, I don't even know if you were paying a mortgage, you couldn't survive off the state pension, could you?
Yeah. So, I mean, in my case, it's like my mortgage will be paid off by the time I retire. But again, I was thinking about for those people who wouldn't be in that situation, and actually what the reality of living on that state pension would be. And we know, again, from our research, and it's, there's a lot of data around this, that more people do have housing costs in retirement, whether that's mortgage or rent. And as people who are younger are taking out longer mortgage terms for reasons we understand, and indeed more are renting because they can't even afford to get on the housing ladder, that is a problem, or that's a challenge that is only going to grow in coming years rather than reduce.
One of the interesting things that has been touched on already is the idea of some of the challenges that are faced among different demographics. So particularly looking at the gender pensions pay gap and some of the things that go into it. So some research came up by the ONS, I think late last year, about how when women take time out of work, their earnings loss can be around 65,000 for the first child. And for the next set of children that they have, the earnings loss gets greater. So I guess for women kind of looking at their pension and thinking about ways that they can make sure that they supplement their contributions, or maybe even apply for pensions credits, what are some of the things that they can do to just make sure that they close that gap as much as possible by the time they get to retirement or think about retiring?
So this is something Sarah and I are really passionate about, and we talk about a lot. And I think, I mentioned it earlier, some of this is about understanding that before you get to that point. So when you're in your early 20s, sort of knowing that there could be a gap and knowing the implications of some decisions you might take. If you're in a couple, having good conversations before someone goes on maternity leave, for example. I think it's, I've got 3 children. They are expensive. They don't seem to get any cheaper as they get older. But
no, they get worse.
I know. I think it is, it's almost automatic that if someone's on maternity leave, they take maybe that year off. You get used to not having as much money. So then if you go part-time, it still seems like an increase in kind of the amount you have had. So I think a lot of people sort of almost, they want to be part-time, but which is understandable. You want to be with your family, but actually it's worth looking at this on a couple's basis. So actually, could both of us work full-time over 4 days or 4 days, for example, and share that care? Does one person have a much better pension, for example, maybe a public sector pension, so, that have really valuable benefits? So just thinking about it, maybe not making different decisions, but just sort of understanding the implications, because then later, maybe when there is a bit of spare cash, if that ever happens, then it's thinking about topping up your pension, for example. And, some people take time out of work completely to care for children. And it's about understanding that even if you aren't working, then your other half could be paying into a pension for you. You can, even if you don't have any earnings, you can still have £3,600 a year go into a pension. So that's that, it might not seem like a huge amount of money, but it's enough that if that's been paying in kind of for a few years, it's worth doing that. And I think, Sarah and I are also really keen on talking about not just when you have children, but women are much more likely to care for other relatives. So maybe in their 50s, they're caring for parents, for example. And that's a point that most people are paying more into their pensions. Perhaps their children are older, and perhaps they've gone back to full-time working. So if you then stop to care for someone, that's going to have quite an impact at a point where you might have been able to pay more into your pension. It's also going to have an impact with, in things like state pension. You might not have those 35 years of credits or contributions. So it's important to think about your state pension contributions as well. And, we've looked at the impact the menopause has on pension contributions as well. And the fact that actually women are reducing their hours to deal with the effects of the menopause, sometimes, stopping work completely. So actually employers can really be helping. And, by sort of engaging with their workforce, we know that if an employer does, and they have solutions that can kind of help people going through that time, women are much more likely to stay at work. So it's really important to have good conversations, to think about, when you are maybe back earning more, to think about paying more into your pension, but also to think about things like state pension as well.
You just touched just then on public sector pensions, and I forgive me if this is not in your remit, and I'm happy to glaze over it, but I do a lot of stuff on social, and what I'm seeing is a growing resentment over public sector pensions, and the fact that the triple lock is quite under threat. And a lot of people are saying, well, why is the triple lock under threat when we're spending so much money on these public sector pensions? Do you have any opinions around that?
It's not something, well, I mean, sometimes I would talk about public sector pensions and, kind of what they mean and what's understood by them. I think it's important when we think about a lot of public sector pensions that, it could be in jobs that aren't particularly well paid. So the pension has always been part of the remuneration package. Now, obviously, there are some people in the public sector who get paid a lot more, but especially, when we look at women in the public sector, they are often kind of lower earners. And, that pension is part of that package. There were changes to the public sector pensions and how they work in 2015 for most of the schemes. So they aren't based on final salary, which they used to be, and now they're more based on career average. So that has had a bit of an impact. But, it is one of these things that I think if you're not in the public sector, you might look at people who are in the public sector and say, well, that seems to be a gold-plated pension. But I think it's looking at it as a whole, that is part of kind of that remuneration package. And for some people, they're not getting paid as much during their lifetime. So, it's an element of that.
So it's basically used to attract talent into those public sector roles.
It's interesting because I'm not sure people in the public sector always understand, especially when they start. Not everyone's interested in pensions. I don't know how that is, but I think
don't know. What else are they thinking about?
I don't know if you go in to be a teacher, for example, and you fully understand the benefit you've got. I suspect probably not. They pay quite a lot in contributions themselves as well, but you maybe don't fully understand what that's going to mean at retirement. I think there's things to look at as well that, for example, if you're a teacher, you won't be able to access this kind of career average part of your pension until you are state pension age. So that could be 67. It might even go up to 68. So there's not the same choice that you could, sort of save more in and stop working at 55, for example, or 57, it will be. So that the rules around public sector pensions are much stricter. And, when you retire, you get some tax-free cash and that pension kicks in. So it's not as easy as someone who's got a money purchase pension where you're building up a pot and you might think, well, I want to work only 2 days a week and I'll top up my income by taking out some of my pension. So it doesn't really work like that as well. But no, I'm not convinced that people who are going into the public sector are going in now thinking, I'm going to have an amazing pension. I think actually a lot of people have different careers and, and that, so they might not stay in the public sector job for that long. And I think, you just have to look at sort of changes within organisations like the police, for example, that people used to stay in that for the full time. And now actually a lot of people go in, kind of do 5 years and then leave. So, so I think it's changed like everything else has changed.
Just on that point of maybe people in the public sector not necessarily understanding how, that sort of thinking, oh, well, actually, I've got this amazingly generous pension scheme. So Claire mentioned about how she gets stopped and asked about the various public sector schemes. So I had a similar experience not too long ago. I was having a scan and the radiologist, as I was being scanned, said, the NHS pension, is it any good? And I was kind of like, yes, it is. And his perspective was, it's been changed so many times and now I have to pay in so much more. Kind of, is there any point? So I was saying, well, actually, the structure of it does mean this, this, and this. But I think there are some people who do, as Claire says, they have been paid very well throughout their public sector careers and they will come out with a very good pension. But that probably isn't the experience of most people. And to Claire's point as well about the lack of flexibility, I mean, the great thing about public sector pensions is you do have that kind of guarantee of what you're going to get. It doesn't depend on how your pot performs. But the bad thing, in inverted commas, is, as Claire says, you have less flexibility about when you take that money and indeed how you take it. And a couple of people I was sort of talking to recently were saying who were in the public sector for part of their career, the majority of it, not necessarily all of it, were kind of saying, well, actually, I want to be able to take less money now because I don't want to pay so much tax, but I can't do that. So this doesn't feel great. And I was like, well, yeah, but the trade-off is you've been in a scheme where you know what you're going to get because it depends on how long you're in the scheme rather than anything else. But it's one of those things, I think the grass is probably always greener in a way. And those people who thanks the changes are paying in, more now than they were a few years ago and who in some cases can't access their pension for some time and don't have that flexibility may not be thinking, well, this is a great, this is a gold-plated pension scheme. I'm very lucky to be in this and, I wouldn't work in the private sector. I don't think life works like that, really.
I think that's such a valuable point.
Especially if you're in a couple, if you have one person in the public sector and one person who's not in the public sector, then looking at kind of your retirement as a couple, and I'd say that about anybody actually, that's kind of looking at your future and planning out how that's going to work. Because you actually might have, you've got a kind of benefit of that guarantee, but you've got some flexibility as well, which if you have kind of two people in the public sector, you don't have the same flexibility. So yeah, it's always about, I think, we think about pension funds as sort of individual, but actually, if you are in a couple, you should be thinking longer term about kind of how it works on a couple's basis and what you'll have in retirement.
I think, that raises such a really good point about thinking about things more holistically. And if you are in a couple, thinking about it as a joint venture. When, I guess, looking at pensions generally, it can get pretty complicated. To what degree does getting financial advice help somebody? And what kind of signs might indicate someone might need to get a bit more specialist help with planning out what their retirement strategy is going to look like?
So I think when people are younger, there's maybe not as much need for financial advice. And so, they're kind of building up their retirement pot and maybe their other savings. I think when, we know that people do take financial advice, then that helps with a bit of kind of education and knowledge as well. So that's good. So they might be more likely to be, for example, invested in a stocks and shares ISA, maybe putting more into their pension because some of those benefits have been explained to them. I think the people who should definitely be thinking about taking financial advice as you get closer to retirement. And that's because, an advisor can sit down, they can help you look at sort of the rest of your life and even beyond, really, kind of what do you want to happen with your savings on your death, for example. And they can help you kind of model that using cash flow modeling or whatever, but they can kind of help explain, and you can tell them, well, actually, if I want to go on, Sarah mentioned 3 or 4 cruises a year, what will that cost? What will I need to do? When do I need to work until? So they're kind of helping with all of that and helping with making some of those decisions about things like funds and stuff like that. And also, I'd say if you are someone who is putting a huge amount into pensions, perhaps you're a very high earner, then taking financial advice is a really good idea, because they can help you with things like calculations for working out, how much you can pay in to your pension without having a tax charge. And, sometimes these can be trickier. So I think it's good if you are a very high earner to have that advice as well at that point.
Yeah, I agree. I think also, though, that we know, and our research shows us this. So we did some research just ahead of 10 years of pension freedoms, looking at what people who were age 55 or over, who had a defined contribution, pension pot type of pension, what information or advice had they taken before they made a decision. And the good news is that most people had taken advice either from a financial advisor, or they'd contacted a free-to-use organisation such as PensionWise, government-backed, that offers guidance. But there were some people, I think it's 1 in 5, who hadn't talked to anybody. I mean, not even friends and family, before they'd made a decision about taking money out of their pension. And whereas, in the old days, I don't know how far back the old days are, but, when people had final salary pensions, so there were lots of people who couldn't join a pension scheme, and then those who did generally had final salary pensions. Well, you didn't really have to make any decisions. But as we know, these days, the decisions that you can make about your defined contribution pension, I mean, there are a whole range of things, from how much tax-free cash you take through to whether you buy a guaranteed income through something like an annuity, or you take income from that pension pot through income drawdown. And if so, how much do you take, and where's that invested? So those are the kind of decisions that lots of people, we don't really have training for that throughout our working lives. And yet the decisions that you make, whether it's on retirement day or whether it's a process of a number of weeks, can have a huge impact on the kind of retirement you have and the money you have. So I think we were quite surprised, to put it mildly, that some people, not necessarily that some people hadn't taken financial advice, because we do know some people either don't want it or can't afford it or don't know how to access it, but that some had not talked to anybody at all, not used services like PensionWise, not talked to their pension provider, not used online tools or calculators, and had just made a decision. Now, for some people, that decision may have been absolutely the right one, but for some it may not have been. And for the sake of taking either advice or indeed free guidance, they might have made a different decision. So I think I agree with what Claire's saying about advice, but also if you, for whatever reason, can't take advice, there are a whole range of other sources of information that mean that you don't have to just think, oh, well, I'll do this, but I've actually talked to nobody about it.
That's a really interesting point, because whilst the landscape of pensions has changed to give us a lot more options and flexibility and opportunity, it also means that we're faced with a lot of decisions that people actually aren't ready to make or don't have the knowledge to make. So that's a good point. But that also, we basically have said that the state pension isn't going to cut the mustard, and you need to think about supplementing that. If you're in a workplace pension, then your employer's likely to choose what provider you go into, and I think a lot of employers are ticking a compliance box when it comes to that, and that sometimes people aren't in necessarily with the best provider, or they may be experiencing fees that are slightly too high. And I think people often don't appreciate how tiny little percentage points can have such a massive impact on their pensions. Is that is that in line with what you guys are saying?
I think one of the things that we are seeing is that people don't know that much about their pension. So we do know, so this research that we did with sort of 4,000 adults, although some people were, for example, checking their pension to see, once a year or more. I said 7 in 10 were checking once a year or more. Some actually were checking it daily, which was slightly alarming, but many people were checking, say, every, it's kind of like, really? And some were checking every sort of 3 to 6 months. But we were also asking people about whether they looked at, for example, how much they might get at retirement rather than how much they have today. Did they know what happened to their pension contributions? And I think from memory, something like 1 in 5 of younger people thought that went into bank accounts. They didn't even know it was invested. Had they checked where their pension fund was invested? Had they tried to move their pension fund? Did they know when they had they changed their sort of the date that they'd chosen for their retirement date? Because of course you can just change that; it's not fixed. So we're really trying to get under the skin of what people knew and what people were doing. Another example is, did their employer offer something called employer matching, where they will match extra money you pay into your pension pound for pound up to a certain limit? If so, did they use it? And we were finding that there were lots of things that, understandably, we all have lives, we're all busy. Claire and I love pensions, but not everybody does, and frankly, it's one of those things that when you're younger, it all feels like it's far too far away, and then you hit a certain age, and then it feels like it's around the corner. And both of those can be quite anxiety inducing, I think. But there may be very good reasons why people don't do these things. But actually, by not just sort of getting under the skin a bit of where your money's going, and if you're employed, it'll be your employer's money as well. But there will be some money going from your salary or earnings. So just starting to kind of check on it. If you don't check on it at all, just check on it. Check on it once, then maybe check on it a bit more regularly. Have a look at where your money's invested. Understand how much is going into your pension. Can you pay in more? Not everybody can, but can you do that? And are there tax efficient ways to pay in, either through something like, maybe if you get a bonus, you could pay some of your bonus in. There are all these things that you may be able to do that don't actually have to be too painful, especially if you can do them earlier on in your career rather than when you're sort of in your 50s or early 60s.
So what would you say to someone who's a bit longer in the tooth and is going, it is too late?
Oh, it's never too late. It's never too early either. But, I think Sarah and I can hand on heart say that we've never met anyone who said that they wish they'd paid less into their pension. And, and I think Sarah's mentioned some of those things that, the benefits of starting earlier, that magic of time. But it doesn't matter when you pay into your pension, you'll get that tax relief. And, if you're an employee, then your employer will also pay into that pension for you. But I think if you are a bit later in your career, then remember and see if you've got any lost pensions. That's, a top tip. That if you've had many jobs as well, sometimes people move house, they forget to tell their pension provider, they forget which pension provider the pension was with. So, remember that, to think about these, you can use the government pension tracing service. So that will give you contact details for the pension scheme. You just need to know the name of your old employer. Now, people can be really surprised by how much they've managed to track down. So, that's a really good tip about doing that. If you are later in your career, you might have got to kind of 50s, late 50s, and maybe you have paid off your mortgage, for example. So it might be that you instead of thinking, I've got an extra £1,000 a month or however much, that you think, I've got an extra £500 a month, but I'll put £500 into my pension. Now, the closer you are to retirement or the age when you can access money from your pension, the easier it is, because actually you might be over 55 right now, and paying that money in, you could actually take, some of your tax-free cash back out as well. So you can almost see the benefit because you're much closer to it. So, I definitely think about that. And Sarah's mentioned about the state pension. I think, remember, check your state pension record, just in case you do have any of those career breaks, you've been working abroad. You can usually buy voluntary contributions to fill them. And it's not much for the kind of, that's going to boost your state pension for life. So check your record. one other, kind of top tip is that if you're a grandparent under state pension age and you're caring for grandchildren, then you can apply for national insurance credits for that as well. So that could make a difference as well. Maybe you've not got those 35 years. So doing that, and lots of people don't know about this. So it's really worth thinking about it if you are in that situation. So
that's such a good tip. I think it's called specified adult childcare credits.
Just real off the tongue.
I know. I've obviously dug deep into this one. I actually released a video on social about it, and like the amount of comments and tags, and it's quite a difficult one for people to get their head around, but it really is worth getting your head around, because it's literally, you're leaving money on the table if you're not tapping into that. And there's a remarkable amount of people in this country who are caring for grandchildren. So it really, it's really worth it, that one. That's a great tip.
Definitely. But it is never too late. Just making even small changes can really help in later life. So, I think just remember that sometimes we worry and think there's no point doing something because it's not going to make much of a difference. Like younger people think there's no point paying an extra £20 a month. That won't make a difference. But actually, £20 a month when you're 22 with the benefit of compound interest can be really worth it later on in life. And it's the same when you're older, that you might think it's too late, there's nothing I can do, but actually you are going to see the benefit, especially if you've got an employer who maybe does pension matching. And we know that quite a lot of employers are doing this. So if you pay a little bit more, they'll pay a little bit more. So there could be more going into your pension than you expect.
And I think one other thing as well is don't underestimate how a pension could help you to save tax. So if, for example, you're a higher rate taxpayer, but you're kind of not too far away over that threshold, and paying a bit more into your pension could mean that you then become a basic rate taxpayer. Or if, for example, you have children, but you're above the child benefit, the threshold for getting child benefit in full and not having to pay some of that back through the also snappily named high income child benefit tax charge, then although we often talk about the thresholds being £60,000 or £80,000 as though that's your salary, it's actually not your salary. You can take off things like pension contributions. So again, depending on your situation, this is where financial advice can be absolutely invaluable. But you could be somebody who's, especially if you are a bit older, you've had some good pay rises. You're at that stage in your career where actually you might be earning, a good amount. You could be on a threshold of a higher tax rate. Paying more into your pension could not just boost your retirement savings and therefore income potentially, but it could also be very good tax planning as well.
Sarah and Claire, thank you. These tips have been really insightful and quite reassuring, particularly if you have gotten to a later stage in your career and you're thinking, okay, what do I do? There is hope, and there are things that you can do which, is invaluable. So thank you so much for your time. We really appreciated this chat. Thank you so much for joining our Investing Insiders podcast. If you like the episode, please subscribe and leave us a 5-star review on your platform of choice. For the latest money news and deals, you can sign up to our weekly newsletter at investinginsiders.co.uk/newsletter-page. We've also got a suite of guides, tools, and calculators on our website at investinginsiders.co.uk. You can also keep up to date with us on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. Thanks for joining us, and we'll catch you in the next episode.